My name is Matthew Sullivan. Over the course of the past semester, I've worked closely with various members of the geography department to put together a sort of snapshot of the region at the time and to sort of illustrate immigration into the Triple Cities, particularly Johnson City. Like Anthony said, a lot of these businesses could not have flourished in the way that they did without a workforce, and that workforce at the time was primarily immigrants. So large-scale immigration into Johnson City occurred as a result of industrialization and the widespread availability of factory jobs throughout the area. Endicott Johnson Corporation, which was one of the leading shoe factories in the world at the time, operated in Johnson City starting in 1899. And the corporation and its majority shareholders and owners employed immigrants who came from various European countries. The development of Endicott and Binghamton were accelerated by businesses such as the Endicott Johnson Corporation, as well as the various businesses that came before and after it. Large groups of single ethnicity immigrants settled into neighborhoods throughout the Triple Cities, and traces of these neighborhoods can still be seen in the 21st century. So this picture displays the Pioneer Annex factory, and it's an old picture from 1927, and it's taken from the corner of Willow Street and Corliss Avenue. So in order to understand why the people came from where they came from, it's important to understand some facts from the literature as well as the immigration rules and regulations at this time. So prior to the 1920s, there were minimal immigration restrictions, and this led to widespread chain migration from European countries. This concept of chain migration is where families from one town in Europe would settle into one town in the United States, so they would settle in close proximity, usually within blocks of each other in the United States. From 1892 to 1954, Ellis Island served as the largest entry point for immigrants, admitting nearly 12 million immigrants in that time span. Chain migration neighborhoods typically were established near the centers of unskilled labor, particularly factories. This photo is taken from the Floral Park Cemetery, and it overlooks Floral Avenue and Willow Street, and it's from 1915. So in 1924, with the enacting of the Immigration Act of 1924, this was the first time that quotas were utilized to sort of pick and choose what countries immigrants were coming from. So the Immigration Act of 1924 utilized these quotas to bring in Northern and Western European immigrants and deter Southern and Eastern European immigrants, which were the primary immigrants at the time span. So some findings in the literature that sort of tie into this project. The first one is that the assimilation model of immigration is accepted in explaining how singular ethnic groups will come to resemble other ethnic groups over time by settling in close proximity to them. In Europe at the time, ethnic segregation was based on levels of income, and both in Europe and here in the United States at the time, spaces of ethnic concentrations occurred throughout the city, with low-income immigrants settling in the inner city, particularly close to the centers of workforce, which were the factories. So using 1940 U.S. historical census data, this map was generated to display the addresses of the immigrants at the time. So the 1940 U.S. historical census data provided roughly 1,500 individual records of immigrants and what country they were from, as well as where they lived throughout the city. So using ArcGIS Pro, which is similar to Story Maps in that it's a product of Esri, this map shows the overall dispersion of immigrants overlaid onto a modern street map. So as you can see, there are concentrations of immigrant settlements all throughout the neighborhood, particularly over here. And there's a big concentration up on the north side of Johnson City where the interstate runs through today. The next map goes a little bit deeper and shows the top 5 immigrant populations in Johnson City. So the results display a strong showing of immigrants from Eastern European countries, which is supported by the immigration the minimal immigration restrictions prior to 1924, and then the immigration restrictions after 1924. So the top 5 populations, as you can see, are Austrian, Czechoslovakian, German, Lithuanian, and Polish. And there's a large mix of immigrant groups forming a multi-ethnic neighborhood on the north side, as well as scatters of multi-ethnic neighborhoods throughout the city. There's also the location of the Endicott Johnson factory, which is marked by this star. And using the scale, you can see that most of these ethnic neighborhoods formed within 1 mile of the factory. So the results sort of show that the makeup of ethnic neighborhoods throughout Johnson City at the time tended to be multi-ethnic as opposed to single ethnicity. And the formation of these ethnic neighborhoods was closely aligned with the concept of chain migration. For example, on the previous map on the northern side of Main Street, there were clusters of Czechoslovakian and Polish immigrants living in close proximity to each other, forming an ethnic neighborhood. And these immigrants settled on the same block in Johnson City. And if you were to look at a more dated map of Europe, you would see that they're from neighboring countries. And ethnic neighborhoods throughout Johnson City formed within 1 mile of the Endicott Johnson Corporation, which highlights the importance of being in close proximity to the work site in a time when transportation was not nearly as widely available as it is today. And to close it out, immigration into Binghamton and Endicott was a result of increased factory jobs and expansion. And the immigrants that arrived in Binghamton and Endicott were of similar ethnicity to those who arrived in Johnson City, with some differences. Particularly, one in particular that's interesting is the north side of Endicott, where there's a strong Italian presence, and this is as a result of the large amounts of Italian immigrants that entered the area in the industrial area.